What if I told you that the single most underpriced structural development in the XRP ecosystem right now is not a price prediction, not a Clarity Act timeline, not even an ETF filing, but a quiet, mechanical, almost boring relationship between two assets that, when properly understood, fundamentally rewrites the demand equation for XRP over the next decade? Strong claim, I know. But before you scroll past this video, ask yourself this brutal question. When a Ripple senior executive publicly states, on the record, that XRP is the engine behind RLUSD on the XRP Ledger, that RLUSD operationally requires XRP to function on the network, and that the RLUSD market cap has grown from approximately $200 million 1 year ago to over $1.5 billion today. Why is retail YouTube not making this the central narrative of the cycle? Because that single statement, properly decoded, means something most retail commentators are too distracted to articulate clearly. It means that every dollar of RLUSD growth is structurally translating into incremental XRP demand, mechanically, without any speculative retail intervention required. The flywheel is not theoretical, the flywheel is operational, and it has been compounding silently for 12 months, while the price chart told a different story. While the crowd is yelling soon and if at each other across social media, something far more durable is being assembled behind the curtain. Today, I'm going to walk you through the RLUSD Treasury flywheel, the native lending unlock, the flare-driven yield infrastructure, the Ripple versus XRP misconception that has paralyzed retail thinking, and the multi-front ecosystem build-out that is happening simultaneously across every layer of this asset's design. And the world, once again, is missing the signal. Welcome back. On this channel, we don't trade hype, we decode structure. Today, we are going under the hood of one of the most operationally significant developments in the XRP ecosystem. The RLUSD XRP mechanical coupling, the native lending protocol activation, the upcoming smart escrow programmability layer, and the broader question of whether Ripple's strategy is structurally aligned with or opposed to XRP holders. No moonboy fantasies, no emotional charts, just the mechanics of stablecoin flywheels, the documented protocol upgrades, and the institutional positioning that retail has been trained to ignore. Before we go under the surface, this is informational analysis, not financial advice. Let's jump in. Let's start with the hard truth. 99% of XRP holders have spent the last 12 months obsessing over price action, while completely missing the structural significance of what RLUSD actually represents. They view it as a side project, a diversification, a hedge by Ripple against XRP's success. That framing is fundamentally wrong, and the people who have internalized that framing are operating from a misunderstanding of the underlying architecture. RLUSD is not a competitor to XRP on the XRPL. RLUSD is a demand accelerator for XRP. Because of how the XRP ledger is engineered, every operational use of RLUSD on the XRPL requires XRP as the underlying gas, settlement layer, and bridging mechanism. That is not a marketing claim. That is a protocol-level technical reality. The Ripple SVP statement on this is not a sales pitch. It is a description of how the chain literally works. Here is what almost nobody on this platform is willing to say clearly. The treasury flywheel that Ripple executives have publicly described, and that almost no retail commentator has decoded correctly, operates as follows. RLUSD, issued under a New York banking charter, supervised by the New York Department of Financial Services, backed one-to-one by cash and U.S. treasuries, is positioned as one of the most regulatorily compliant stablecoins in the entire ecosystem. As corporate treasuries, payroll providers, custody platforms, and institutional treasury management systems integrate RLUSD as their preferred regulated stablecoin, the RLUSD market cap expands. As the RLUSD market cap expands, the operational volume on the XRPL expands. As the operational volume on the XRPL expands, the structural demand for XRP, as the engine underneath, expands mechanically. This is the multiplier effect Ripple executives are referring to when they discuss RLUSD's trajectory. David Schwartz has, in different language, alluded to this exact dynamic in technical interviews about the XRPL's architecture. Brad Garlinghouse has framed RLUSD's role as additive to XRP, not competitive with it. This is not coincidence. This is convergence between architectural design and commercial strategy. And once you see the convergence, you cannot unsee it. Let's do the math, the kind retail desperately wants to ignore. RLUSD went from approximately $200 million in market cap to over $1.5 billion in market cap in approximately 12 months. That is a 7.5x growth rate in a single year. Now project that growth trajectory forward as treasury management, custody systems, and eventually payroll integrations begin onboarding. If RLUSD reaches even $10 billion in market cap over the next 24 months, a number that, given the institutional integrations already in progress with platforms like Xrpl, is structurally plausible. The operational volume that flows through the XRPL increases by a multiple that translates directly into XRP demand pressure. If RLUSD reaches $50 billion over a longer horizon, which would still place it well below the largest stablecoins in the market, the implied XRP demand pressure becomes structurally enormous. Now layer the broader stablecoin macro picture. The global stablecoin market has been growing in compressed timeframes that traditional finance considers extraordinary. Stablecoins are quietly becoming one of the most important financial innovations of the decade, because they solve the operational integration problem between traditional finance and blockchain infrastructure. Institutional treasuries cannot hold volatile assets at scale. Compliance departments will not permit it, but they can hold a fully reserved, NYDFS supervised, one-to-one collateralized stablecoin issued under proper banking oversight. RLUSD is purpose-built for that institutional onboarding role. And every dollar of RLUSD that flows through the XRPL is a dollar that operationally requires XRP underneath it. Now layer the supply mechanics. XRP has a hard cap of 100 billion tokens. Roughly 40 billion remain in escrow under transparent on-chain release rules. 5 to 7 billion are estimated permanently lost. Approximately 800 million XRP are now locked in ETF custodial structures. SBI Holdings has issued instruments redeemable in XRP. Evernorth Holdings holds hundreds of millions of XRPs as treasury reserves. Strategic reserves, partner allocations, market maker inventory, and long-term institutional holders absorb tens of billions more. The actual freely tradable float is far, far smaller than the headline number suggests. And the freely tradable float continues to compress, regardless of where the price action is on any given day. This isn't a prediction. It is the structural output of stable coin demand, mechanically pressing on a fixed supply settlement asset. If you have a problem with these numbers, you don't have a problem with me. You have a problem with how the XRPL architecturally works. Now let me walk you through the native lending unlock, because this is the second structural development that has been criminally underreported in retail commentary. Two major XRPL ecosystem upgrades are activating to enable a native lending hub directly on the XRPL itself. The first is the native lending protocol, fully decentralized lending infrastructure built for both institutional and consumer-grade use cases. It enables the deployment of liquidity pools and the issuance of fixed-term loans directly on-chain against crypto collateral without intermediaries. The second upgrade is advanced programmability through smart escrows and flexible transaction condition automation tools, giving developers smart contract-like functionality for managing locked funds while preserving the XRPL's signature high-speed, low-cost transaction characteristics. Read those two upgrades carefully. Together, they unlock something fundamentally new for XRP holders. They allow holders to access liquidity from their XRP position without selling the underlying asset. You collateralize. You borrow against. You retain your exposure. You eliminate the forced selling pressure that destroys long-term positioning. And critically, the lending happens directly on the ledger itself, not through a third-party platform sitting on top, not through a custodian holding your XRP while deploying it elsewhere. The XRP never leaves the environment you already trust. This matters more than most retail commentators have processed, because the same XRPL that the Japanese banking proof of concept showed settles approximately 60% cheaper than SWIFT. The same ledger that Societe Generale put its regulated euro stablecoin on. The same ledger that the DTCC's infrastructure is now connected to through Ripple Prime. That ledger is now becoming the environment where institutional lending happens natively. The structural significance is that institutional and retail lending finally have a shared, neutral, transparent, settlement-grade layer where they can interoperate without the trust and counterparty risk that has historically separated them. But, and this is the discipline experienced analysts maintain, every yield-generating mechanism carries risk. Anyone telling you to risk your entire position chasing yield is providing you with bad advice. The native lending infrastructure is new. It is not yet fully battle-tested in production at institutional scale. The smart move is to wait. Observe how the early deployments perform. Monitor what protections emerge over time, and recognize that as institutional players like BlackRock, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, and other Tier 1 names eventually offer regulated yield products on top of the XRPL, those products will likely come with the kind of institutional-grade insurance and protection infrastructure that retail-tier DeFi cannot currently provide. The future is bright. The transition takes time. Disciplined patience captures the structural upside without absorbing the experimental risk. While retail is panic selling at the lows and yelling soon at each other on social media, the institutional signal has never been louder. Look at what is actually happening, not what is being broadcast on Twitter. Former Ripple executive Dan Morgan recently highlighted a documented real-world XRP payment flow operating in the corridor between the US dollar, XRP, and Mexican pesos. A corridor that has been operationally active for years, that integrates directly into the $150 trillion global cross-border payments market. The corridor exists, the settlement works, the pricing efficiency is documented. What is currently missing is the institutional volume that would translate corridor activity into measurable XRP price impact. And that missing volume is, structurally, what global regulatory clarity is engineered to unlock. Ask yourself this brutal question. Why is Washington holding closed-door bipartisan crypto tax roundtables this very month? Why is the House Ways and Means Committee specifically convening to shape the framework for crypto taxation in the United States? Because they know, at the highest levels of legislative planning, that once the Clarity Act is in place, an enormous wave of capital is going to flow into this space. They want the tax framework ready to capture the taxable activity that wave produces. the government does not invest scarce committee time in tax frameworks for asset classes it believes will remain marginal. It invests committee time in tax frameworks for asset classes it expects to absorb trillions of dollars of value. That is its own structural signal. Look at the broader chessboard. Ripple has spent the last several years deploying over $3 billion in strategic acquisitions, specifically to build the institutional bridge required for whale-tier capital to commit at scale, Metaco for bank-grade custody, Standard Custody for New York regulated trust services, Hidden Road as a prime brokerage clearing, trillions annually, Rail for stablecoin-powered payments, G-Treasury for Fortune 500 corporate treasury management, Palisade for advanced wallet and custody technology. This is not a startup hoping for adoption. This is the steel and cement of the new financial system being poured while retail is staring at minute candles. Now let me address the Ripple versus XRP misconception that has poisoned retail thinking for years, because clearing this up is essential. There is a persistent narrative on social media that Ripple is dumping on XRP holders, that Ripple's monthly XRP sales somehow indicate a lack of commitment to XRP's success. That narrative is not just wrong, it is structurally backwards. Brad Garlinghouse has stated explicitly on the record that Ripple is the largest single holder of XRP, meaning Ripple's incentives are mathematically more aligned with XRP's success than any other single entity on Earth. Chris Larsen, one of Ripple's co-founders, is positioned to become one of the wealthiest individuals in financial history if XRP appreciates structurally. Ripple, the company, becomes dramatically more valuable as XRP appreciates. The financial alignment is absolute. The accusation that Ripple is somehow indifferent to XRP's success is the equivalent of saying Apple is indifferent to iPhone sales because they occasionally use the revenue to acquire other companies. The acquisitions are how the institutional bridge gets built. The institutional bridge is what enables XRP's long-term price discovery. The cycle is reinforcing, not extractive. Then there is the broader ecosystem layer. Flare's infrastructure provides compute, data, and execution capabilities that extend XRPL's reach into additional yield-generating use cases. As King Kuran has noted, expect major exchanges to integrate Flare's technology to provide XRP yield products over time. XRP is the asset and settlement layer. Flare provides the compute, data, and execution layer on top. The combination expands what XRP holders can do with their position, while keeping the underlying asset secure on the XRPL itself. Distribution and yield capability layered on top of settlement and security infrastructure underneath. Two complementary systems, not competing ones. So when does this collide with the visible market? Pay attention here, because the catalysts are no longer theoretical. The Clarity Act and broader market structure legislation moving through Congress represent the immediate regulatory unlock. The Senate Banking Committee markup is on the calendar. The path from markup to floor vote to House reconciliation to presidential signature projects on the realistic timeline into the early summer window. Once the bill is signed, the institutional capital that has been parked at the certainty threshold begins deploying. In Asia, Japan's Financial Services Agency has already moved decisively. The Bank of Japan continues to publish CBDC research that explicitly discusses interoperability layers. The European Union's MiCA regulation is now fully operational. Each of these is another wall coming down. And critically, RLUSD's growth and the XRPL's native lending infrastructure do not pause based on US legislation. They continue compounding, regardless of which week the Clarity Act actually clears committee. Then there is the macro layer. The Federal Reserve continues to evolve its posture. global debt levels continue to force every major central bank to consider new settlement architectures. The IMF has openly discussed the need for a more efficient cross-border framework. Layer on top of that the rise of AI agents requiring instant programmatic settlement. The fuse is already lit. There are multiple fuses. They are lit in parallel. Now let me address the soon and if frustration directly, because it is a real psychological issue in this community. People have been told for years that institutional adoption is soon. They have been promised price predictions that depend on if certain catalysts arrive in certain windows. That cumulative frustration is legitimate. It is a real psychological burden. But here is the honest assessment. The reason the word soon gets used so often is that the underlying catalysts are genuinely scheduled. But legislative and institutional processes do not deliver on the precise timelines retail emotional urgency demands. The reason if gets used so often is that multiple catalysts need to align for the largest scenarios to unfold, and responsible analysis acknowledges that contingency. The frustration is not evidence that the thesis is broken. It is evidence that the gap between retail emotional time horizons and institutional operational time horizons remains significant. The discipline is to extend your own time horizon to match the institutional one, rather than expecting institutions to compress their timelines to match retail emotion. That is the asymmetric mental advantage that separates the people who actually capture the upside from the people who exit in frustration just before the breakout. Now let's talk about the side of the equation most people refuse to confront. Supply drain. While the demand side is being assembled by RLUSD growth, native lending demand, ETF custodians, sovereign adjacent institutional partners, treasury vehicles, AI-driven payment flows, and the macro liquidity wave, the supply side is being quietly removed from the open market. Exchange reserves of XRP have been trending lower for an extended period. CryptoQuant data, Glassnode analytics, on-chain forensic researchers, every credible source confirms the same trend. Tokens are leaving exchanges and entering custody. Once a token enters a multi-signature institutional vault, an ETF custodian's reserves, a treasury allocation, or a long-term holding wallet, it does not come back to market for a 10% profit. It is gone. It is parked. It is reserved for the new system. We are moving from an era of abundance to an era of scarcity, and retail has not priced this in. Think about what that means in practical terms. When RLUSD scales further, when native lending matures into institutional production, when the regulatory switch flips, when the institutional gates open, the available float on exchanges will be a fraction of what it appears to be on paper today. Order books will be thin, buy walls will be hollow, and the price discovery process will not be gradual. It will be violent. The XRP rich list already shows wallets in the shark tier, those holding between 100,000 and 1 million XRP, growing in number through every recent down cycle. Long-term holding wallets sit at all-time highs. The supply transfer from impatient hands into patient institutional custody is not a future event. It is happening right now, in real time, on the public ledger. New buyers will not be buying whole XRP eventually. They will be buying drops. 1 XRP equals 1 million drops, and very soon, drops will be the only unit late retail can afford to accumulate. There is a phrase you will start hearing more often: the great priced out. The window is closing. Not in years, in quarters. The institutions have spent half a decade trying to shake you out so they can take your position. Don't make their job easy. I know exactly what you're feeling right now. You're watching red candles. You're seeing the same arguments recycle on social media. Ripple is dumping. RLUSD is killing XRP. The catalysts never arrive. You're seeing influencers pivot to whatever shiny narrative is trending this week. And the temptation to give up, to internalize the FOD, to accept the misframings, to exit out of frustration with timelines, has never been louder. I understand that. But my job is to help you distinguish between noise and signal. The Ripple is dumping narrative is noise. The RLUSD is competing with XRP narrative is noise. The soon exhaustion is noise. The signal is the RLUSD flywheel mechanics, the native lending unlock, the smart escrow programmability layer, the flare yield infrastructure, the documented institutional cross-border corridors, the $3 billion Ripple acquisition spend, the regulatory pathway that is actually scheduled, and the supply structure that is mechanically contracting against expanding demand. None of that stopped because the price went sideways. It accelerated. Being early feels exactly like being wrong, right up until the moment reality catches up. That is the cruelest psychological trap in this entire industry, and the institutions know it. They are counting on it. They need a steady stream of exit liquidity from the confused and the frustrated to fund the entry of the patient and the informed. Markets reward anticipation, not confirmation. By the time the RLUSD flywheel reaches its multiplier inflection point, by the time the native lending protocols mature into institutional production, by the time the Clarity Act passes and the institutional capital deploys, the early positioning window will be closed. The patient holders will have already set their long-term positions. The late buyers will be paying premiums on a constrained float against fully unlocked institutional demand. The combination of the RLUSD Treasury flywheel, the native lending and smart escrow upgrades, the flare-driven yield distribution layer, the documented payment corridor utility, the $3 billion institutional acquisition stack, the legislative window queued in Washington, the parallel regulatory clarity in Asia and Europe, the macro liquidity environment approaching, the demographic gravity of generational wealth transfer, and the constrained supply structure. All of this is converging in the same multi-quarter window. This is not a single catalyst. This is a structural convergence operating across multiple independent fronts simultaneously. The XRP thesis has never had this many simultaneously aligned variables, not at any prior point in this asset's history. Let me leave you with this. Price action is a distraction. The flywheel is the reality. One is a chart. The other is the mechanical, architectural, multi-vertical compounding of RLUSD growth, lending demand, institutional payment flow, ETF accumulation, and supply contraction operating simultaneously on the same network. The question is, are you watching the candles or are you watching the flywheel? History does not reward comfort. It rewards those who pay attention when the room is quiet. And right now, the room is very, very quiet, exactly the way it needs to be, while the structural compounding continues underneath the surface. If you made it to the end of this analysis, drop the word flywheel in the comments. I want to see who actually understood what was decoded today. If you value this kind of deep structural breakdown, subscribe and turn on notifications because the catalysts are accelerating across every front simultaneously. The math doesn't lie, and the system is almost complete. Stay patient. Stay rational. And as we always do, we don't wait for the future. We plan for it. This content is for informational and educational purposes only and is not financial advice. Always do your own research before making any investment decision.